Either racism and white supremacy exists or it does not exist. See, it's not something that's a figment of Dr. Welsing's imagination. Mm-hmm. Now, if people look around them, and, you know, this is something that so-called younger generation of black people, if they feel they have white friends, ask their white friends, what do you all talk about when there's no black people around? What do your parents talk about when there's no black people around? Are you aware that white people have an easier time getting jobs, getting a sufficient salary, getting loans, whether it's for a house or a car? Do white people, how many white people that are your friends want to change places with black people? Because black people don't really have any special problems. See, so if instead of, oh, that's something that older black people talk about, but it really doesn't exist. See, it means that, you know, people are simply not even aware. They don't do much reading because there's all kind of research and all kind of studies documenting the hard time that black college graduates have getting jobs compared to whites today, 2014, 2015. So if black people want to pretend that nothing, there's no such thing as racism, I think that their white friends and colleagues, they don't want to change places with a black person. Why? See, in other words, again, either racism, white supremacy exists or it doesn't exist. Either President Obama receives more death threats than any other president in history. Either President Obama is disrespected more than anybody else. Either Miss Obama is disrespected. Either these are realities, or do you see, if younger black people ask their parents, are you treated the same way as people who classify themselves as white on jobs? When you go to get a loan, are you treated in the same way? Do you see? So the question would be, why is it that, you know, maybe younger black people don't want to look at reality?
See, and so if a scientist, a behavioral scientist, will say, well, this is very interesting. Why would this occur? What is behind this behavior? Why this attack on the black man's genitals? And I say that if we begin to understand the fear of genetic annihilation, because what is in the genitals, what is in the testicles, do you see? The genetic material is in the testicles, do you see? And so if I have a fear of being genetically annihilated, then the brain computer will cause me to attack the person's genitals. I even say that, you know, what is called justifiable homicide. And justifiable homicide does not refer to, because we don't have instances of black men in police uniforms, do you see, so-called accidentally killing a white male. We don't have any record of that. But the record...
Say that again. Say that again. Say that again.
See, you don't have a record, or, you know, of black police officers saying, oh, I shot that white male. I thought he had a weapon. There's no record of that. But we have, you know, the record is, you know, gross with innumerable instances of a white male in uniform. You know, could be a 14-year-old black male, or it could be a 45-year-old black male. I shot him. I thought he had a weapon. And then that's called justifiable homicide. Now, I say deeper, what is going on is that within the white male's brain computer is he looks at the black man and he thinks about the black man's genetic power that resides in the genitals. And that, in his mind, subconsciously, is a weapon. Do you see what I'm saying? Because, see, we never talk about these issues. These issues that I'm talking about, you see, I would guess that they've never been talked about in the history of television. You see, to talk about what is actually going on around this issue of fear of genetic annihilation, so that I thought he had a weapon, and so therefore I shot him. Well, he does have a genetic weapon, if you want to call it that. And I say that that also accounts for the language that is used, the great equalizer. I wish we had a blackboard, because, again, to go back to looking at the male genitalia, and you can see if the brain makes an abstraction, it's going to be a cross. Okay, if you look at a lateral view of the male genitalia, you have something that looks almost like a L. You see, if you turn that around 90 degrees, and you have something that looks like this, and it's an abstraction of a gun. And then we call that the great equalizer. You see, and then it's worn at the level of the genitals and at the hip level. So I say that the brain computer, you see, in the white collective and the white male collective specifically, that if, there's looking at the black male and saying he has a weapon, meaning his genitalia and his genetic material, that can cause my annihilation, and so the brain computer says must create weapon, can do same thing. You see, and then that turns out to be the gun.
That is the voice of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing on that very now epic interview that she did with Listervelt Middleton on For the People, right here on WPFW Jazz and Justice Radio. And, of course, she talking about, the justifiable homicide. And I played that because of the study I just read that came from, again, some researchers from Harvard, Stanford, and the U.S. Census Bureau that just was published today in the New York Times. Extensive data shows punishing reach of racism for black boys, and talking about, just the various things that I just mentioned and laid out. And I think it's a nice bridge between Dr. Welsing and, because she's talking about the greatest threat perceived by the system of white supremacy, the system of white terror domination, is black men, because they have the highest potential of being able to confront it on a physical level. It was what she always talked about. And so it makes more sense that, as this study indicates, that black men, are going to face so much racism. Black boys are going to face so much racism. And the justifiable killing, of course, under the system is dealing with the piece about law, when she talks about the nine areas of activity, which were first put to us by Neely Fuller. And of course, her question was why? Why is that? Well, why are these areas and so forth? So that's where she laid that out. Now, yesterday we celebrated her birth anniversary. I believe she would have been 84. And her spirit was definitely alive. And I always say that, we leave pieces of ourselves in all those folks that we touch, whether physically or just ideologically. And one of the people who definitely fits that description is our next, I wouldn't say guest, she's a family member. Dr. Patricia Sekhmet Newton is joining us again. She is a psychiatrist extraordinaire, and she's been on the show before, and she has really, yesterday when you did a presentation, Dr. Newton, I mean, it was just, just mind-blowing to me, your perspective on gentrification. I don't even say it's your perspective. I just think it's just your research that you did to really kind of show us what gentrification, ethnic cleansing really is. And the way that you presented it, I thought was worthy of the audience getting a taste of. You're presently the CEO and medical director of the Black Psychiatrists of America, president and medical director of Newton and Associates there in Baltimore, served as assistant professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, as well as past examiner for the American Board of Psychiatry, chairperson of the Department of Psychiatry at the former Providence Hospital in Baltimore, graduate of Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, where you served on the faculty after residency training at the Barnes Hospital Group before relocating to Baltimore, holding a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health, Baltimore, a master's in molecular biology from Peabody College, Vanderbilt University, BS degree in pre-medicine at the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff, special courses in languages and culture at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. You have a very long list of accomplishments. We're not even gonna get through all that. But you also, but I'm just gonna end it by saying that you work with traditional and indigenous healers of South America, Ghana, Senegal, and South Africa, and is an installed female king and queen mother of the Ashanti region of Ghana. And so you are joining us here today, Dr. Patricia Sekhmet Newton. Jumbo, welcome back.
Oh, thank you, Madasi. I'm glad to be back. And I'm grateful to know that people got something out of yesterday's lecture. It was an honor to be asked by Sister Sabrina to help celebrate the Frances Welsing birthday and institute. So even though I had a lot to do that day, I could not say no.
Definitely, because you have mentioned many times that I've heard you that Dr. Welsing was the inspiration for you going into psychiatry.
Absolutely. I was on my way to be a surgeon, and she said, "You're a thinker, not a cutter." And so that's it. Yeah. And it was honored to have her elder sister there yesterday as well, Mama Lauren, and to have her, really endorse kind of what I was attempting to relate to the audience about the whole issue of gentrification and why, this whole issue around Dr. Welsing and her home and all of that on 16th Street and all the drama that surrounded that was so critical, because this would have been the third time that her family had been uprooted from their home, twice in Chicago and now with her home in Washington. So that has to have had an indelible effect upon her psychic as well as her soma, upon her body, her mind, and her spirit.
And it made me wonder, like, who heals the healer? Who could she talk to?
Well, she came to me.
Okay.
I mean, at the, when things got overwhelming, as I said yesterday, she called me and she said, "I want to come and see you." I said, "Well, fine." She said, "No, I want to come and see you as a patient." And I'm like, "Oh, not so fine." You know what I mean? For a number of reasons. So I appreciated the fact that here's the person that really is the reason that I became a psychiatrist. Now coming to me, to be her psychiatric physician, and that was just overwhelming. It was an awesome honor, but one that I certainly was humbled by, and wasn't too sure at that point if I was up to the task. But of course, it worked itself out in the context of she felt like she could trust me, and I was happy to be available for her to trust. And so your question is very germane, who the healers go to, and there has to be one or two people somewhere in their lives that they can trust enough with their own feelings that they can be vulnerable enough to have someone facilitate and assist them in their healing process.
Indeed. That's the voice of Dr. Patricia Sekhmet Newton right here on WPFW, Jazz and Justice Radio, the Afrikan Deep Thought edition, talking a little bit about Dr. Welsing before we get into this issue of ethnic cleansing, which is really just wreaking havoc all over, really the globe, but in the United States in particular. And we talk about Dr. Welsing. I played a little clip there, a couple of clips there of some of the things that she was saying, that were in relation to this discussion. And I think that I always wonder, like, what she would really be talking about today in terms of this discussion, particularly given her experience, as you were just talking about, with ethnic cleansing. I have a caller that called in a couple times talking about, he said he's adamant, like, do not call it gentrification. It is ethnic cleansing. And it made me, got me to thinking that, like, what's the definition? So I looked at the UN's definition, and part of it is rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove persons of given groups from the area.
Yeah, which is consistent with her description of aggressive gentrification. Very descriptive because, it's an imposition. It's an imposed and assault, and it is, without regard of human beings' situation, their state of mind. It's to accomplish whatever goal, that there is to accomplish. And, what is happening, of course, in the U.S. is people are attempting to, quote, beautify, end of quote, the neighborhoods and raise the tax base. There was this flight from the cities, and now that people are coming back, they want to recap. City fathers and mothers, politicians want to recap, the dollar value of the property that was abandoned at some point. And they're looking at neighborhoods that are vulnerable. And neighborhoods where black and brown people live are extremely vulnerable. And the zones where very well-to-do people live are not vulnerable. They're almost impenetrable.
And, it made me think about, it's kind of broadened the net a little bit. And I was thinking about, these areas that have been targeted. And you talked a little bit about, and I've heard other people say things in terms of how the gentrification started really, or the ethnic cleansing started really in the 60s with the uprisings. And the communities being kind of, torn up, and folks just in their frustration, just kind of, burning things down. And I was thinking in a wider context about how the United States government, for instance, in what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine. And she says how the United States will use either natural disasters or kind of like political unrest in certain countries to take advantage and then to move in and then take over. And the kind of same thing happened in New Orleans, where we saw the natural disaster that they always knew was coming. Houston, the same thing. They always knew these hurricanes were going to come, always knew it was going to wreak all this damage, and they didn't do anything to build up the barriers and so forth. And so when the opportunity finally came, then they just took those areas away from the black people. And gentrification, in a sense, is more of a man-made disaster, if you will.
Well, yeah, because, it implies that people of a higher income status are moving into an area, usually displacing those of a lower income status. And communities that have no ability to fight, advocate, demand policy changes are the ones that are at risk, and the ones that developers are going to target, along with those people who make policies that permit that kind of targeting to occur. And the sad reality about it is that, you can improve neighborhoods without having to dislocate and displace human beings, but it requires a level of, 1, consciousness, 2, commitment, and 3, caring.
And when we look at this term, the sanitized term for ethnic cleansing, gentrification, the root of it, of course, is the term gentry.
Right.
And let's in the context of what you said yesterday, I was like, let me look up that definition. And you gave us a real jewel with this thing. And I'm gonna just read this definition, and then I want you to take off from there and what you were talking about, because I just thought I was just so revealing. I was just like, whoa. I don't know if everybody else got that, but to me, I was just like, whoa, that was like real.
That was your light bulb moment.
Yeah. I mean, I knew we saw what it was, but we don't really understand exactly what it is. And check this. This is the definition of gentry: people of good social position, specifically the class of people next below the nobility,
right,
in position and birth.
Right.
You can take it from there.
Well, what's interesting with that definition is very clearly what is going on, because the nobility, if we were to put it equivalent population group, that would be the so-called very rich or rich within our community.
Yeah.
and the class below them would be the upper middle class. Would be the middle class, up middle class people who are actually the ones who are making these entries into these communities, primarily of color, older communities, because the nobility class or the very rich are not letting them come into their communities. They're zoning them out, and they're creating barriers for a lesser income person, even though they may still not be poor, but they're middle class. They don't want the middle class necessarily in their neighborhood.
And what you said is so important, because they are the real middle class. Like it,
right?
Because we think, at least I'm gonna just speak for myself. I thought that they were the nobility. I thought that they were the nobility.
No.
But they're not the nobility.
No, they're not. And so that the anger gets targeted from our communities with the people who are moving in, who have means, because they really have no place else to move.
Right.
I hate to say that, but they've been barred from the upper echelon. And unless you get some liberalization of zoning policies within cities to offer real diversification, it's never going to change. And so people who are on the bottom of the socioeconomic status, who primarily are your older persons or or African persons or Hispanic persons, are going to be always displaced or put in a situation that when the middle class, not the upper class, move in and the tax base gets raised and the property values go up, then it begins to displace the people who have been the core of those neighborhoods for generations, because they may not be able to, many of them are on fixed income, and they've been living in these properties for decades, and are retired and no longer working or whatever. And so they cannot afford the tax hike that's going to increase the property values. And that just creates another level of anxiety, and oftentimes, in many instances, hastens their physical demise. And mental, disturbances occur out of depression, anxiety, frustration, anger, and that then internalizes people into having all kinds of physical gastrointestinal problems, cardiac problems, increased aches and pains, like rheumatoid arthritis increases because the stress increases the inflammation, and all the other things that go along with that, occur. And then people begin to not function. And then their health care their health goes down, and then you are ending up raising their premiums on their health care. So now you've raised their property taxes. You're raising their premiums on their health care because they become increased utilizers of health, and you have a situation that is volcanic. It's volcanic. It's going to erupt into something that is totally destructive to a neighborhood, and people of good conscience, ought to be able to live harmoniously. The upper class, the rich, have always made it so that the lower classes, middle class and below, fight each other, so that they become immune and out of the way of the dynamics. And so the anger gets turned on all these young people who are moving in with their dogs and their young children into these communities. And then what happens is that in order to keep that tax base up, governments, city governments, local, state, and federal governments, mostly local and state governments, will begin to put money into those areas that they have denied putting money in before, to improve the schools, to improve the roads, to improve the kinds of services, sanitation services, to upgrade the buildings, to tear down dilapidated buildings, decrease what they consider drug trafficking and crime. And so all of the things that ought to have been done all along, now all of a sudden have a new motivating force that is tax dollars, tax base, that will change the structure of the community, and when that does change, the culture of the community changes.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of key things in what you were just saying. So the gentry, these people who are not the nobility, who are not the upper class, and the upper class don't want to live around them.
No.
So they make it easier for them to move into the city. Now, this is the other thing. This is the thing that's so interesting, because one would think, okay, well then they're in solidarity with us then. But the reality is no, they're not in solidarity with us. They will subsidize their white kindred, folk, who they don't look at as being themselves or up on par with them. To the exclusion of us. So they don't like them, but they don't not like them as much as they don't like us.
Well, and they don't like them to the degree that they would not assist them in not being with them.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And another thing too that you mentioned, these gentry are coming in. These are middle class people, and I said that they are real middle class, and I said that because a lot of people. These terms are floated out here, and we don't really know what they mean. Like middle class, middle class is going to vary depending on where you live.
Upper, lower, and middle class. Yeah.
Most of us want to believe that we're middle class.
No, and if some of us are lower middle class.
Yeah, and the thing is that when you look at wealth, and I've been talking about wealth a lot here, and I just read this one piece earlier, and there's a study that came out a couple years ago by Darity and Company, where they talked about how the median black family only has about $1,700 in accumulated wealth.
Oh, yeah.
So even if you make a six-figure salary, as a black person, the median income for white families, for these middle class people, pretty much is $137,000.
Absolutely.
And it's climbing while ours is dropping.
Absolutely.
So while we have these jobs that make us six figures, and we go out and we spend, and we have these big houses, we have the big clothes and the cars and all this other stuff, and then you're looking at how the city's changing, DC was, made, the richest, area for black folks pretty much in the world because of the fact that the government contracting jobs, the government jobs that we had. But as this city is changing, then we know that what else is going to change?
Yep.
Them jobs.
The jobs
and the contracts
are going to change, number one. And number two, even when you had a good government job, as they say, it still cost you more to buy a house, to get a mortgage rate that's reasonable. So even those who are just real consumers and spend a lot, that's one level. But those who are more modest in their expenses are still going to pay more for the same amount of property that their white counterpart are having the same kind of job. The other problem that also has to be put on top of that equation is the number of female-headed households. And as you know, women are not going to make the same salary that men make. And many of the people who are being gentrified are women. They are women who are head of households, women who are widowed, women who maybe have retired. And so you've got a whole nother level being added to that, and that's the gender disparity in terms of salaries. And then you have the ethnic and so-called racial disparities in terms of salaries. And then thirdly, as you just described, the loss of the good government jobs in a climate that is a lot more racially biased, sexually biased than we've had in a while. So there is a culture that is emerging that is designed for the destruction and the sanitation and the cleansing of a large segment of the population who heretofore, while they were not totally immune, had a little bit of buffer.
And that is the voice of Patricia Sekhmet Newton, right here on WPFW, Jazz and Justice Radio, the Afrikan Deep Thought edition. Talking about ethnic cleansing, also known as gentrification. She is a psychiatrist in Baltimore. And why are we talking about gentrification, ethnic cleansing with a psychiatrist? What kind of psychological impact is that going to have?
Well, if you lose your house, you're under stress. Because as you know, your home is the largest amount of income and the largest asset that most of us have. It's the only appreciable asset that we have. Our car starts to lose money when we take it off the lot. the house begins to accrue, equity and wealth in that context as an asset, the longer you keep it and the longer you keep it up. And so we're talking about what happens to people who have historically been traumatized, now being newly traumatized with the loss of the one thing that kept them grounded and basically secure, and that's their home. So now we're dealing with the rug being pulled totally out from under you, and the rest of you being thrown under the bus. And that creates severe anxiety, severe depression, and as I alluded to earlier, those interact with the rest of the body and create a number of unhealthy situations. So why are we talking about it? Is because these things that happen in the environment that are politically driven and economically motivated out of greed have great impact upon the mental health and mental well-being of the victimized population, to the degree that they begin to not be able to function adequately, already marginalized. Now they are not functioning. And so that increases their chances for not only severe illness, but death, and also loss of jobs, loss of support, loss of everything. And so you don't think that makes somebody depressed, and if your audience doesn't get that connection, God help us.
We're talking to Dr. Patricia Sekhmet Newton right here on WPFW Jazz and Justice Radio. Are you willing to take any phone calls?
I am, and I just wanted to say that, we at the Black Psychiatrists of America, which is a national and international organization, have really taken on this thing seriously about what is going on and how it's impacting the overall mental well-being and safety and security that people. So, if you know Maslow's law, you know that safety and security is what? Basic. It's at the bottom of the, basic human needs. So if those are not being met, the foundation is gone.
It reminds me when I was talking about, the whole disaster capitalism kind of thing.
Exactly.
And it reminded me, we talked to some people, some organizers down in Houston right after the hurricane, and they were talking about the fact that people were displaced and didn't have a home. And then, of course, if you have to drive miles and miles away to get away from the flooding, then you're going to lose your job. And the job may not open. And if it does open again, you haven't been there and they can't contact you because the phone doesn't work. You don't have power. So you're going to lose your job. And they were just talking about the traumatic impact that it had on the people there in terms of losing their houses that way. So there's just so many different ways that trauma is used, that terror really is used against us.
Yeah, it's domestic terrorism.
Yeah. I mean, and it's just, even if it's a natural disaster, the response to it is non-existent. And then of course you have these man-made ones. What can we do to combat this?
Well, there are lots of things we can do. And yes, as I said, I'm willing to take questions as well. But well, first of all, we've got to recognize it for what it is. And understand who the real enemy is, and not be wasting our energy always displacing it on the people that are moving in. We need to be dealing with the folk in the halls of city government, and we need to be advocating and agitating and demanding some kind of level of liberalized zoning so that all of our people are not totally wiped off the face of this earth. We need to also create some kind of caps on taxes for people who have lived in a certain community or vicinity or neighborhood for an extended period of time. There ought to be some kind of way that we can advocate that if you've lived in this house or owned this house for greater than X number of years, then your taxes should not be put in the same category of the new folk moving in who have raised the property value to the point that you have to move out. I think that's a very critical point, that we can look at how you advocate and put caps on certain levels of taxes. We have to have more community organizations that are willing to tackle City Hall and stop re-electing people who don't care for you except for when it's time to vote, and demanding, that something be done. Because let's look at the African American community. It is the older people that go to the polls. It is also these same older people that are losing their property. So we have to put that association together. And thirdly, I think that we need to begin to, like we tithe at church, we need to have community organizations that start to tithe so that we can create adequate legal defense funds, adequate tax, perhaps assistance programs, where we begin to help people so they don't lose their homes while we're advocating for tax caps and for liberalized rezoning. And we're going to have what I call community mental health, meaning that group therapy of the community to help us cope with what is happening and to have people not feel so isolated and alone about this process.
That is the voice of Dr. Patricia Sekhmet Newton right here on WPFW taking phone calls. Right, there's some issues there trying to lock in Dr. Newton. I don't know what's going on with that.
Sanitize this conversation.
Hey, I'm saying they're trying to ethnically cleanse this thing. You know what I'm saying? You can't even talk no more about this stuff. All right, so we got Yusuf on the line. Yusuf, go right ahead.
Yes, sir. I just want to know if Dr. Newton had
if she had a what?
If she has an address and a phone number for her organization, and also if Dr. Lauren Cress Welsing, is she still in town?
Lauren Cress, Love. I'm not sure if she's in town. She was here yesterday, but I'm not sure if she's still here today.
Right.
But you can just take that off the air. She can get the information right now. All right, thank you.
Yes, I can be reached at 410-752-2943. That's 410-752-2943. And Black Psychiatrists of America have offices in New York and in D.C., so you could call that number, or you can email .patnewton, DOCPATNEWTON, @gmail.com.
All right, so let's move on to the next caller. Caller, what was your name?
David.
Caller?
Yeah, David.
David, go right ahead. Go right ahead, David.
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Thank you for...
Can't hear.
David, can you talk into the phone? I can't really hear you.
Can you hear me now?
A little bit. It's kind of bad connection there.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll try to speak up.
Are you using a speakerphone?
I was. I thought
Okay.
I turned it off. One second.
You sounded much better once you got closer. Please don't use the speakerphone because it makes it difficult for us to hear when we have conference call. All right, so go right ahead, David.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, for having this excellent program. And but I had a question relating to what Dr. Newton thought that maybe, what do you think is different now than how things were in the past? And the reason I ask is because it seems like when we were, I guess, maybe more persecuted or had more problems, we were more together. And I'm just wondering, we've always had problems. We've always had problems with gentrification or not being able to get credit or not coming out on the short end of the stick with jobs or just we've always been oppressed.
Got the sense of your question. Go ahead and hold on for the answer.
Oh, okay. Well, what he's saying is certainly a fact. The problem is that when people were moving us and isolating us in our so-called communities, they kind of left us alone once we were over there, and so we had to depend on ourselves. And integration changed all of that. Notice I didn't say it was really a kind of a desegregation process. Changed that.
I'm sorry, Dr. Newton.
There's a noise in the background.
Dr. Newton, can you hold on for me? David, can you turn down the radio? David. David. Okay, I'm going to have to let him go because I'm hearing all the feedback from the radio.
Okay, well, anyway, I'll go ahead and attempt to answer the question.
Okay, go right ahead.
So when integration came and people were moving out of our neighborhoods in many instances so they could, quote, go in with the gentrified group at one level, then we lost our cohesiveness. And in the instances, say, for example, like in Oklahoma, where Black Wall Street for African Americans was extremely successful, of course we were attacked and destroyed. But as long as we just looked like we were barely making it and depended on ourselves with our own businesses and our own organizations, people kind of left us alone. And then when we became much more, quote, vocal and much more outspoken in terms of us displaying our so-called newly acquired wealth, the buying of things, then people began to take another look at us. And as people moved out of the cities, I'm talking about Europeans moved out of the cities, letting the so-called natives have it. And then they realized that what a mistake that was because they were losing their tax base. And then they began, as he said, to start gradually trickling back in to reclaim what, quote, they want was theirs, while the rich people still stayed in their neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is that people began to look at what they lost and begin to want to claim it back, mm-hmm. and begin to develop social networks, buying politicians, buying votes to guarantee that they would be able to do that. The disintegration came with us from certainly the period of our enslavement, but there was a period of time where we were working more together, where we owned our own businesses, where we managed our own schools and all that kind of thing. With the integration, that changed. And when that changed, it created a vacuum and left a door open for anything and anyone to come in and crack it wide open.
All right. And 202-588-0893 is the number to call in right now. You want to speak to Dr. Sekhmet Newton, Nana Dr. Patricia Sekhmet Newton, right here on WPFW. Now is your opportunity. We have some lines open. Going to move on to the next caller. Caller, your name, where you calling from?
Vincent Hawkins. I'm calling from Washington, D.C.
Vincent?
Yes.
Go right ahead.
I'm a D.C. resident. I've been a long-time resident.
Vincent, you sound a little...
I cannot hear him.
Vincent, you sound a little muffled.
I can't hear him.
I don't know if you're too close to the phone, but you're very muffled.
Okay. I'm sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, that's much better.
Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
First, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to say what I'm going to say, and thank you for saying what you're saying. I own a home in the district, in the area that is being really heavily gentrified. I paid under $150,000 for my house. The houses around me are now being sold for $700,000 and more. And my taxes, which is strange because I am a senior, long-time homeowner, and they tell me 3% per year is what they can go up on for my assessment value. 3%, I don't get 3% raise on my in 3 years. That 3%, 10 years is 30%. There's no way I can make it. Those be completely out of my thing. And the other thing is that being a retired government worker, I saw when I was working that they were getting rid of all of the regulators. Anybody that was a inspector, those are the first people that were getting fired from our job. So, can we talk about that?
But what time frame was that?
I retired in 2001.
Okay. All right. So you said they were getting rid of all of the inspectors.
And inspectors, yeah, because they were downsizing. There was this big thing about government being too big.
And of course, deregulation.
Deregulation.
Yeah,
so,
deregulation.
And then we now hear that the mayor is getting ready to get rid of the comprehensive plan. I worked on that for almost 15 years.
Yep. All right.
She's trying to get rid of it. So, yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Newton?
Well, he's a classic example of what I was describing earlier about being a retiree, about not being able to deal with these major increases of 3% that have been legislated. And again, I must reiterate and stress the need for the development of community organizations that will demand a cap on taxes for people who bought their homes over a certain period of time. That, of course, can be determined by the community, but the failure to do that is going to always keep people at the mercy of folks who are going to attempt to move you out by pricing you
Can
out
I say something else,
in terms of taxes. Yes.
I remember because my parents had also owned a home. I remember when the taxes, the real estate taxes, were point of sale and not assessed value.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, our government went up to this assessed value thing, which started getting rid of us. So if we go back to point of sale, I mean, like, hey, I can pay taxes on what I bought the house for.
But
People
I think it's important for you and other neighbors to begin to start advocating and agitating for that, because we can talk all we want on this radio, but until you start putting people in office that are going to meet your needs, then, it's just so much hot air,
I agree. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Going to move on to the next caller. Your name, where you calling from?
Agitating.
Yes, go right ahead. Please turn down your radio. Please
Okay. Somebody else is ready now.
Okay, go right ahead. I can still hear the radio in the background. It's only you.
Okay, my radio's down. What you want me to know? We just want to know.
Okay, just go ahead and state your question.
My question is, you want to know my question?
Yes, please.
Okay, I went to a meeting. What they're talking about now.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a meeting last night. Last Saturday, a big meeting over Union Temple. It was the D.C. Grassroots Planning Coalition. Okay. You heard
Yes,
me?
yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can hear you.
And that was our coalition goal is to reject OP changes to the plan that leave real estate speculators uncontrollable to D.C. communities, strengthen the comprehensive plan approach to equity, affordability, and environmental justice, put the people back in the planning process. Who are we? We are Empower D.C. Washington Local Claims for the Homeless, People for the Fairness Coalition, One D.C., Metro D.C. Democrats, Socialists of America, D.C. for Reasonable Development, D.C. Statehood Green Party, Fair Budget Coalition, Civic Citizens Association, and the ANCs from throughout the city. They were there last Saturday at Union Temple, and this is a big thing going on. And I'm in a wheelchair, but I got over there, and I want to keep up with everything that's going on. It says stop the comprehensive scam.
Okay, well, thank you so much, D.C. Grassroots Planning Coalition. I appreciate that information.
Tuesday, March, rally and pack the hearing room, D.C. Council hearing room on the comprehensive plan, Tuesday, March the 20th.
That's tomorrow.
I got to be there. 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock rally, 2 o'clock hearing. I'll be in the John Wilson building at 500 1350 Pennsylvania Avenue. I will be there, and I hope everybody listening to this program will hear me and be there, okay?
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that information. I just looked it up. That's tomorrow at 1 p.m. over at the Wilson building right here in D.C. Going to move on to the next caller. Caller, your name, where you calling from? All right, please put you on hold and make sure when you pick up the phone, make sure when you get through and I pick up the phone, turn down the radio so that we can get right to it. We don't have a whole lot of time. Caller, your name, where you calling from?
Yes, peace, my brother. How are you?
Peace, and love.
Yes, am I one, black man?
You are on.
Okay, peace, Sister Patricia
Peace,
Newton. Yes, ma'am. I saw a PowerPoint of yours, probably about you at UDC. Wow, that had to be about 15 years ago, ma'am.
Okay.
And it was absolutely wonderful. Absolutely, on white supremacy.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to ask you, in reference to all the controversy that's going on with the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, and how the powers that be, speaking specifically of the wicked Jews that he mentioned on the lecture he did at Savior's Day.
My brother, we want to stick to the topic, though. I mean, the topic is we're talking about ethnic cleansing, gentrification.
Yes,
not about, even though I hear you just saying they kind of using him as a litmus test and all that, but that's not the subject for today.
Yes,
but do you have a question about the subject?
Yes, I want to ask her, what does, as Dr. Francis Cress Welsing taught us, I mean, if you don't understand white supremacy, how and why it works, everything else will deceive you or fool you. Do you think we will wake up as a people to what's really going on in this country, this place called North America?
Well, here's my answer to the question. If you don't wake up, you're going to die. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line.
There's no happily ever after.
Yeah, bottom line.
There's no happily ever after. A lot of times we get caught up in just thinking it's just going to be all right and things will just work out and we can just pray it away and all that stuff. It just doesn't work. You can pray, like you said. I think it was. I don't know if it was you. Or,
it was me.
It was you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Could you just repeat that, or at least kind of give us, just restate that?
Yeah. What we do is just, we just pray on it and give it to the Lord in prayer. But God helps those who help themselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's very succinct. Caller, your name. Where you calling from?
I'm calling from Ashton, Maryland.
We'll go right ahead.
Yeah, I've always considered gentrification to be like the continuation of Western expansion that drove the it's still driving indigenous people off their land. And it's not, I know a lot of focus on what's going on in the cities, but it's happening in what is now called the suburbs. It's like where I live. This wasn't always the suburbs. It used to be country. And it's like over the years, it's become more gentrified, and I'd say in the last 10 to 15 years, it's been nothing but McMansions being built out here.
Absolutely.
And that's driving my taxes up, and I can't afford to stay here almost. I mean, I'm paying so much just in property tax that it's ridiculous. And this happened to be an area in the county where a lot of the free Africans prior to the Civil War lived, and I'm seeing fewer and fewer black faces out here. So it's kind of like they're hitting hard in the cities now, but there's been that slow expansion out in the country, turning into the suburbs and turning into the uber suburbs.
Yeah.
So they're trying to. So where are we going to go? We're going to meet somewhere in the middle and be crushed. Concentration camp. That's what that's called. I forgot.
Yeah. Well, his point is very well taken, because what you're seeing is an expansion of cities, but also the creation of newer cities. And with that. Again, the rich are pushing the middle class, real middle class, as you call them, into these annexed areas. And at some point, the African Americans who moved there as middle income people, feeling that they would be safe there, are no longer safe, because people are expanding and people have development ideas and views of how they're going to reconstruct, the nature of these cities and the natures of these annexed portions of land territory. So there's a big land grab, and again, you're going to be caught up because of the whole tax structure. And I think the gentleman that made the point earlier about point of sale might be a very good way to look at how we can fairly cap taxes. You know what I mean?
Indeed. That is the voice of Dr. Patricia Sekhmet Newton. She has joined us today right here on WPFW. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Newton. This time has flown, as I knew it would. And, of course, if folks wanted to get back in contact with you, how can they do that? I know you have a practice there in Baltimore.
But mostly I'm doing the administration of the Black Psychiatrists of America. But I'll give my email again. It's DocPatNewton@gmail.com. DocPatNewton@gmail.com. And time always flies when you're having fun, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we thank you so much for joining us, and just really the information. I just think that folk can get an opportunity to hear you speak, or to just glean from any of the wisdom that you have. I think they would do themselves a huge favor in that regard.
Well, thank you very much. You're very kind.
Yes, and thank you for joining us, and we'll have you on again very soon.
Okay. Peace and blessings to you and everyone.
All right. Peace and blessings. That's Dr. Patricia Sekhmet Newton right here on WPFW. This is Jazz and Justice Radio, the Afrikan Deep Thought edition. And again, the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition is tomorrow. They have a rally, and then going to go in and challenge some of these folks on this ethnic cleansing situation. That's tomorrow at the Wilson Building at 1 p.m. It's a comprehensive scam rally and hearing. And again, the Wilson building is at 1350 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest in Washington, D.C. And it's interesting that as you have so many of these, the Negroes were here signs all over the city. The Wilson building now has the bust there of Marion Barry, right as the people that he tried to help the most are being pushed out of the city. So they'll still have their Negro was here monument to him while pushing us out at the same time. I just think that's an incredible situation. But it is what it is. And so I appreciate Dr. Newton coming on and sharing with us today.